Good morning. My name is Scott Fisher, and I am the chair of the Board of Psychology. And as you come in here, you'll see a lot of people with black shirts like this. Those are board members and board staff. So feel free to ask them questions, to introduce yourself. They're with the Board of Psychology, but they are the good guys. And the staff in particular have done a lot of work to get the conference together. They work hard every day to serve the public and to help us out. So if you like the conference, if you like the fact that a regulatory board would even have a conference, if you've seen the new website and you like that, if you've had calls to the Board of Psychology and you've got good, helpful information, thank those people. They're very serious about doing their job, and they're wonderful to work with. So I'm going to tell you the truth about being a member of the Board of Psychology. I'm really sorry to say there are not a lot of perks. I have this shirt. I kind of like the shirt. But I didn't come here in a limo this morning. It was a Camry. We don't have champagne at our meetings. And I have no entourage. Not even a small posse. I thought when I was elected chair, maybe a small posse, but it hasn't happened. But I do have one really significant and important and worthwhile perk today. And that is that I get to introduce the executive director of the Board of Psychology, Angelina Barnes, who is a wonderful person to work with and has, I think, a really rare combination of being serious-minded about her work, but also very lively and vigorous and full of energy. It is not easy to find somebody who can do both of those things, and the board and us as psychologists have profited from that. So I'm looking at Angelina, and she's now starting to get slightly uncomfortable. I can read. I'm a trained psychologist, and I can read facial expressions. And she wants me to stop complimenting her, stop talking about champagne and posses, and read the piece of paper that they gave me to read. So now I'm going to do that. Ms. Barnes serves as the executive director of the Minnesota Board of Psychology, with responsibilities as the chief administrative officer. Ms. Barnes is an attorney in good standing in the state of Minnesota and obtained a Juris Doctor degree from William Mitchell College of Law and a bachelor's degree in social relations from Michigan State University. Ms. Barnes will be your trail guide on today's journey through the rest of the program today.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Fisher. I really appreciate that. I'm honored this morning by the outpouring of interest in attending this conference and grateful for each of you who chose to spend your Thursday morning with us. The mission of the board is to protect the public through licensure, regulation, and education, to promote access to safe, ethical, and competent psychological services. One of the ways in which we meet that mission is through educational offerings such as the event today. It wouldn't be possible, though, without the hard work of an incredible team. And with the extra hours, many extra hours, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank them for making this conference possible. So thank you to Kelly Finn and Leo Campero and Josh Bramley and everyone else who's here today to make this event possible. They definitely are the group of people who make me and the board look good. In terms of content, we're going to be exploring this morning the proposed interstate compact for the practice of psychology through telepsychology and temporary practice. and we'll take our discussion beyond traditional geographic boundaries that have frequently limited access to care. And I do that this morning with great excitement and pride in the state of Minnesota, who has just this morning signed into law as the 8th state the medical licensure compact. So that might not ring significant to us this morning just yet, but it demonstrates Minnesota as a leader in the area of getting compacts in place to allow for some of these challenges to fade away. Later this morning, you will also get to see our complaint resolution team in action in a role play that explores the complex and sensitive issue of licensee impairment, how the board investigates and deals with impairment, and the options for resolution when public safety is at risk. However, before we get to our content, I want to make sure we take care of housekeeping, which are some very critical items. I'm going to cover the essentials. So staff, as Dr. Fisher pointed out, are wearing these charcoal shirts with the logo. And they are here to make your experience a positive one. Feel free to ask them for anything you need, and I'm certain that they will be happy to assist you with that. If you raise your hand, they can come around. You have cards in front of you, or should have, or they will provide them soon, for comments. If you have any questions or comments or things you want us to address, go ahead and fill those out and give them to a staff member who will make sure that we get those answered, whether they be about substance or anything else we can do for you this morning. Coffee and beverages, also critical for the caffeine needy, are complimentary throughout the day and located in the beverage area to the right when you're facing the registration table. Our restrooms are located right outside the entrance of this room to your right. We also have handicap accessible restrooms located down the ramp near registration. And if you need help with any of those, please just grab a staff member. Our power strips are limited, but they are located on the outside walls, and you can use those for recharging. We are on Twitter. The board prides itself on its communication as well as using innovative technology. And we will be managing our Twitter account, so if you are interested in that, the hashtag that we're using is Beyond the Boundaries, and that will link all of the conversations together and allow us to respond. There's also a survey in front of you there. I believe it's purple. If you could complete that throughout the day and hand it in to receive your most important piece, your certificate of attendance, so that you can get the well-deserved credit for this event. Finally, we have a new addition to our conference this year, which is the video feedback component. Board staff have a location set up following the conference to hear from participants via video feedback. So stop by, see Leo. Leo, where are you? There, hand in the back, hand in the back. Share with us your remarks about your experience at today's conference. We'd also love to hear your thoughts substantively about the PSYPACT or the Interstate Compact that Dr. Siegel will be introducing today, or anything else that we can do to make it a positive experience. And on that note, don't hesitate to let us know. It's our pleasure to get us started today, and I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Alex Siegel. Dr. Alex Siegel is the past president of the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, or ASPPB. He is the current director of professional affairs, and for those of you who aren't familiar, ASPPB is comprised of all of the regulatory boards from the United States and Canada charged with the regulation of the practice of psychology. Dr. Siegel is both an attorney and a psychologist and has served on Division 20 of the American Psychological Association, the Philadelphia Society of Clinical Psychologists, and the Pennsylvania State Board of Psychology for 2 4-year terms. Dr. Siegel is a frequent presenter at local and national meetings and received his Juris Doctor degree in 1985 and completed his Ph.D. in clinical psychology in 1988. He maintains a private practice as a clinical and forensic psychologist in Pennsylvania, and most pertinent to his role here today, Dr. Siegel played an integral part in the development of the joint guidelines for the practice of telepsychology, as well as the development of the Interstate Compact, which we will be introducing today, also known as the PSYPACT. With no further delay, I give you Dr. Alex Siegel. Yep, just to the side there.
Oops. You can take that.
Knock the thing off.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Fisher, Ms. Barnes, the Minnesota Board. Thank you very much for inviting me here to make a presentation. I really should change that intro. I haven't written that in about 10 years. Half of that stuff is no longer true, but and while I was chair of the Pennsylvania board, I had police escort any place I went in the Commonwealth. Just remember that as we'll go through that because it comes back. I wish I had them with me this morning, but okay. So Angelina told you a little bit about ASPPB. Let me tell you a little bit more about us. We're the people that you probably hated when you had to take the EPPP, the exam. And when I meet with students, I usually say to students, look at my face, look at this ugly mug, and when you're studying for the exam, if you want to get pissed off at anybody, you'll have an image to throw stuff at, and you'll have a person that you can be very upset with when you are studying for the EPPP. So what we do is, as Angelina says, we assist jurisdictions in the United States and Canada to help them as a resource to regulate the practice of psychology. Some of the things that we do is help with mobility and trying to get national standardization in the United States and Canada, and we're very much involved in the interjurisdictional telepsychological practice. Some of the things that we do, are there early career folks in here or students, academics? So one of the things that is probably the most important thing I can say, besides the telepsych, is the credentials bank. The credentials bank it's free to students and early career folks. It's $200 for everyone else. What that does is you bank your credentials with us, and we will primary source verify that. So that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, if you want to move to a different jurisdiction, instead of going back and finding the original supervisor, if that person is still alive, and getting a contemporaneous letter, boards will accept what we have as primary source. If you're a student and you don't know where you're going to end up, it's in a safe place, and then you can push a button and to go to different jurisdictions and send that information. I live in Pennsylvania, and in 1994, there was a fire in the Department of Transportation building where all of psychology and medical records were kept. This was before the days of microfiche. So technically, I can't prove to you that I'm a licensed psychologist because all of my paperwork and credentials were burned up in the building. So I can't then move to a different jurisdiction because I can't prove that I was licensed. So it's a great idea. I wish we had it when I was much younger to bank your credentials, and it will allow you a little more flexibility if you choose to leave Minnesota. The other things that we're working on is the PLUS system, which is a universal application. Much like the universal application for college, as jurisdictions sign on for it, the students can fill out the PLUS system and then push a button for that to go to any jurisdiction that they're applying to. We're also putting that with the API, and so that as you go through the process of getting together your internship hours and so forth, it'll kind of vertically go right into the application for licensure. And the other things we kind of work on is CPQ, which is the mobility device. This is a certificate of professional qualifications, which Minnesota is one of the 44 recognized states. And so out of the 64 jurisdictions in the United States, we have 55 states and provinces which recognize the certificate of professional qualifications. And CPQ is really an expedited license. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the medicine and what Angelina said a few minutes ago. And then we also work on... So why telepsychology? What I want to do is kind of take you through the process about how we started and where we ended up, rather than just talking about PSYPACT, because I think it gives you more context and the frustrations and why it makes sense to go towards a compact. So when we talk about we're only talking about interjurisdictional practice. We're not talking about intra-jurisdictional practice. That's left for the Minnesota State Board of Psychology to deal with regulations within your state. We're kind of looking at the national and international perspective. So licensing boards would say, hey, we want you, if you're going to practice in this jurisdiction, you need to be licensed. If you're coming into our jurisdiction where the patient is, you need to be licensed. Psychologists, on the other hand, want to say, wait a minute, I have one license, it's in cyberspace, I'm still in my same seat in my office, I don't need to be licensed into Pennsylvania if the patient's there, or Ontario if the patient's there, I just need one license. And so there's a conflict from what licensing boards and regulatory boards want and what psychologists want. So it's untenable to require everyone to get licensed in every jurisdiction. Although there is a gentleman who's a very well-known forensic psychologist who does death penalty work, and he's licensed in 22 different states. He has a full-time person to keep up with the different continuing education requirements and different requirements, but he is one of the leading experts in death penalty on an IQ and so forth. And the other side of the coin, it's also unrealistic for a licensing board to allow you to come into their state without some type of regulatory oversight. And it's also a due process and equal protection. If you're going to allow someone to come into this jurisdiction that's not licensed, then how can the board require you guys to be licensed to practice when you're here? So it's kind of a compromise about how we go forward with this. One of the frustrating parts about interjurisdictional practice is which laws control what. If I'm in Pennsylvania and the patient I'm seeing with is in Minnesota, and I do something inappropriate, Minnesota is probably going to say, wait a minute, we don't have jurisdiction because you're not a licensee, you're licensed in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to say, wait a minute, you're licensed here, but the action took place in Minnesota and the patient's there, and our charge is to protect the citizens of the Commonwealth, and we don't care about anybody else in the country. I'm from the East, so. And then you have conflict laws. How do you reconcile different laws? One that comes to mind is duty to protect. In Minnesota, you have a fairly unusual duty to protect warned by saying others. So most states will say if a patient tells you something that's foreseeable, imminent, you have a duty to protect or warn. Minnesota has a law that says, in addition to that, if someone other, a significant family member or so forth, tells you something, you still have a duty to warn. Now, if you go to Pennsylvania, which is what a Tarasoff state, Tarasoff won, so you have to warn the patient if the patient you have to warn the victim, the intended victim, if the patient tells you. California says you can protect that person by hospitalizing them, maybe going from 1 day to 3 days of therapy or whatever. So what laws do you apply? And now you throw into Texas or Iowa, which say confidentiality is more important than duty to warn, so that if you're in Minnesota and a patient in Texas tells you, I'm going to hurt someone, if you tell that victim in Texas, you violated confidentiality in Texas. If you don't do it here, you violated the duty, your statute that says duty to protect. So that's one issue about how states need to work together and how you resolve this to kind of go forward. The other thing is record keeping. And it's a simple example, but your law requires you have to keep records for 8 years. And if for a minor is turning the age of majority, you still have to keep it for 8 years. Pennsylvania is 5 years. New Jersey is 7 years. Which law applies? I mean, that's easy. In that situation, you just take the harshest of the more restrictive thing of 8 years. But if you're in Ontario and you don't have to keep records for kids past the age of majority, if you don't know what's going on in Minnesota, you violated Minnesota's law. All right. So we began thinking about this in about 2008, and in about 2011 there was a commission or a task force set up between the APA, ASPPB, and the insurance trust. And the focus there was to kind of how can we look at what the problems are? How can we come up with guidelines to assist people who want to go down this road? And the third step was, how then can we come up with regulatory language to make the practice safe and ethical of going across jurisdictional lines? So the definition, as you can see, Telepsychology is the provision of psychological services using telecommunications technology, including but not limited to telephone, mobile device, interactive video conferencing, email, chat, internet. And so when I say telephones, everyone says, that's not telephones. I mean, this morning, I had a call from a patient. So technically, if it wasn't an emergency, I probably would be violating Minnesota's law because I'm not licensed to practice here, and yet I talked to a patient interjurisdictionally, and because it was an emergency, that kind of trumps everything else. But had it not been, and had someone just called me up to say, you know, I really want to change my appointment from 10 o'clock tomorrow to 2 o'clock tomorrow, and I had a conversation, I probably violated Minnesota law, practicing without a license. So from there, we came up with, so here's more of the definitions. So it can be in writing or an image, sounds or other data, and this word I can never pronounce, synchronous with multiple parties in real time, so like chat rooms and video conferencing, and asynchronous email, bulletin boards, and so forth. So we try to cover the whole gamut of telepsychological communications. What the task force came up with was the following 8 guidelines. Competence, and I'm going to talk briefly about this. So no one's expecting anyone to be an IT expert here, but you need to be competent in the use of the technology if you're going to use telepsychology. So you should know that, for example, Skype is a great thing to talk to grandkids. It's not a good vehicle to talk to patients. It's not HIPAA compliant. If you read that thing about Skype, you know, the 46 pages of legal things that everyone scrolls down to the bottom and hits I accept, go back and read what you just accepted. You accepted that they could sell the information. You accepted, which could breach confidentiality. You accepted the fact that all their servers are in Jersey, so now you're going through Jersey to provide the services. And you also accepted the fact that until there's a linkage, that information can be hacked or discoverable. So there are other more secure vehicles and video platforms that you can use to provide the services. So you need to know some things about that. You also need to know competence to provide what I would call the emotional competence to be able to provide services 2,000 to 3,000 miles away. What happens if a patient tells you they're going to suicide? What happens if you're on a conference and the patient says, I'm going to hurt myself, and the link goes down? What do you do? Do you have contacts in that community to help that person? Are you obligated to do that? The standard of care and delivery of telepsychological services is that as you go through the process, you must follow the standard of care and the ethical codes of the American Psychological Association or the Canadian Psych Association as you kind of go through the process of starting a relationship and continuing the relationship. The third is informed consent, which I think is a hallmark for all of this. How do you let the patient know what you're going to do in terms of providing services? There's some that would say that you really should only use this telepsychology if it's the only other choice, like someone that's infirmed and can't get out of the house, like someone that is agoraphobic, or someone in a distant place that can't come. And there are other people on the other extreme that say, I want to have a full-time telepractice. I don't want to see anybody in my office. So now we're trying to figure out ways to accommodate both of those individuals, both those professionals that want to provide the service. So how you go about setting up informed consent? Do you talk about what happens in an emergency situation? Do you talk about what happens if the technology goes down? Do you talk about the differences of law and what would apply here for under a duty to warn type situation? And you can handle most of those through the informed consent process as long as it's a robust informed consent and you both understand what's going on. The other thing is, obviously, you need to maintain the confidentiality of the data and the information, and also the security of the information, the hardware. What do you do to protect against hackers or viruses? or people that want to, well, no, let me switch gears. Or when you want to terminate the next one or dispose of it, how do you do that? Do you just throw your hard drive away? Do you just get rid of your emails? Or do you need to do it in such a way that it's no longer there? If you remember the Microsoft case many years ago, when Microsoft was sued, they deleted everything, so they thought. And they realized that just because you push the delete button, it's still in the hard drive, and it was still discoverable. So you need to ensure certain ways that you're going to wipe clean whatever's there. And now if you're going to be having an email conversation, is that part of the records, all those little emails? I would think yes, it should be part of the records. Is it okay to keep it electronically, or do you need to kind of print that into a paper version? As we kind of move to electronic records, and I think everything is going to be electronic, so there are other considerations about how you go about securing the record and so forth. Testing and assessment. Can you do a Rorschach 3,000 miles away? It hasn't been normed for it yet. Is that violating the norms? Can you use a psych associate? Your jurisdiction may allow you to use someone to do that, as long as you're overseeing it. Can you have that psych associate give one of the Wexlers to the person in the next state over? So these are the issues and that goes back to informed consent, and that goes back to knowing the laws. And as we kind of go forward with reliability and validity, they're now beginning to test or develop the reliability and validity for some of these tests on the internet, so that they will be kind of be normed and standardized, and they'll be more ready to be used. And the last one was the interjurisdictional practice. And so what the task force is, and for those of you that know APA, guidelines in APA are aspirational. They use language like take reasonable steps to ensure. You should know the laws of both jurisdictions, which are great for guidelines, but as a psychologist practicing and as for a licensing board, they don't mean a whole lot, because licensing boards look at the minimum standard of care. So if someone were to have a complaint filed against them for violating one of these things, and the standard is to take reasonable steps to ensure, it's a hard standard to hold someone to, because what's reasonable steps to ensure? So those then become regulatory in nature, and the licensing boards will then kind of say, what are those steps? How do we ensure that we have those reasonable steps in place to ensure the protection of the public? Psychologists are included in that, as well as clients and patients. So what we did at an ASPPB, we focused primarily on Guideline 8, the interjurisdictional practice. And so while we're doing this with APA, and I was a staff member to that joint task force, ASPPB was focusing on two different documents to look at the regulations. One is the e-passport, and the other was the ASPPB standards. And Angelina Barnes was part of the ASPPB task force looking into that. And I was staff to that as well. So what we did, and we'll talk a whole lot more about e-passport towards the end, but e-passport is basically, it kind of promotes a standardization for how do you provide the services. It facilitates the process for licensees to provide services across jurisdictionals. It provides, hopefully, for consistent regulations. I talked about keeping records. Is there really a number is there an empirical basis about why one state would take it for 5 years or 7 or year 8? Why couldn't we just throw a dart, put numbers on the board and throw a dart and whatever one is, and everyone agree that we have to keep records for 7 years? It would simplify the practice. But because licensure is a state-based practice, it's not a federal practice in the United States due to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, as well as the Supreme Court decisions. States have the authority to set their rules as they see fit. But it does come across as a barrier for mobility for psychologists, and clearly for interjurisdictional practice. So what the e-passport tried to do was to set a legal fiction between the psychologist, the licensing board of the home jurisdiction where the psychologist was, and the distant psychology board where the patient was. And saying it's kind of like a three-legged stool. you needed to have a contractual relationship among them so that the individual could be provided services and that the licensing board could ensure that the services were regulated and that the public was protected. And then the process was ASPPB would then go through a set of criteria, and when people would apply for an e-passport, to vet the process, to make sure that you had the right education, to make sure you came from a licensed program, came from an accredited, a program that was acceptable to the telepsychology practice, whether it's accredited or designated or some other, depending on what the criteria are, as well as the competencies of that individual. So as we go through the passport, we now then kind of evolved into psychological principles. So the first one is telepsychology is nothing new. It's not a new branch of psychology. It's just a different technique. So what you need to follow is basically what the standards of care are for you in more traditional practices. You need to incorporate that into the telepsychology practice. Number two, you need to be licensed in good standing, meaning no discipline in your home jurisdiction. You should be aware of the location of the patient. Now, so if you think you're in Minnesota and you think you're talking to someone in California, when in reality the person is living in Louisiana, it may cause problems in terms of what laws do you find. And clearly, you need to make a good faith attempt. If you ask the patient and the patient tells you I'm an X, you can rely on that. But if you don't ask the question, then you're setting yourself up for some types of problems. So it's important to know where the patient is. The fourth criteria was to notify all the licensing boards into which you were going to practice that you were coming in. Minnesota has a guest privilege, so if you're going to be here more than 7 days and up into within a 9-month period of time, you have to notify the board and get permission from the board. Other jurisdictions don't do that. Other jurisdictions say, like Louisiana, there is no temporary or guest privilege. You need to be licensed here, so you can't even talk to one of our people for 1 second unless you're licensed here. And that became a big problem with Katrina because there were a lot of people that wanted to go down and help, but they could not because of the law. And once the governor then suspended all the rules and declared an emergency state, then people could come in. And lo and behold, what did we find? Most of the people that have been disciplined and reprimanded by licensing boards flocked. So there was some concern about are the ethical people or the unethical, the ethical people were also coming, but there was a lot of unethical and people that had their licenses revoked that were coming in to help. And there was nothing at that point Louisiana could do because all the laws were suspended. The next one, so what we decided in ASPPB was that the practice was going to be based where the psychologist was in the home jurisdiction. That goes back to the question, where is the jurisdictional, which state controls? And ASPPB made a decision over a long period of time that the only way to do this is you can only require the licensee who's in that state to follow those laws. Now, and whereas we'll see in a minute or two, medicine makes a different decision. They say the practice is where the patient is, as opposed, but how they're conceptualizing things is a lot different, and we'll talk a little bit of that in a few minutes. So also, you also need to continue, if there are conflicts in the law, you need to let the patients know. You need, through the informed consent process, how you're going to handle that. You need to be competent in technology and service delivery. Ensure the electronic and physical security, integrity of the client's records are there, including communications and data. You need to be competent in maintenance of privacy, confidentiality, and security matters as it relates to the equipment. So one is the data communication and one is the hardware. You also need to let patients know how to file a complaint against you in your jurisdiction. Because a patient can pick up the phone here and call the board, or the board may even have a complaint file, a complaint form on the website, but if you're going to be 3,000 miles away, you may not know what to do or how to do that. So again, to kind of work on transparency and accountability. And the last is establish, we touched about this briefly. What do you do when there's failures in the hardware? How do you handle emergency situations? I can tell you in where I live in a suburb of Philadelphia, 10, 15 minutes outside. If a patient tells me they're going to hurt themselves and they live in Philadelphia, I could pick up the phone and call the police, and the police will acknowledge the call, and sometime maybe in the next 6 to 9 months, they may show up to see what's going on. It's not high priority in Philadelphia. But in the township that I live in, if I did the same thing, they'd be there in 5 minutes. So you're going to need to know the nuances as how do you handle it? Do you need to know someone there? Should you have a contact person in that place so in case something should happen? Now, as an attorney, we always think about the worst case scenarios. As a regulatory board, we're always thinking about how do we protect the public. What we're talking about here, in your practice, is relatively rare occurrence. But if you're not dealing with that issues, if it does happen, and that's when people, in my opinion, get caught up and get in trouble with the licensing law and ethical board, or the patient gets in serious difficulties and you're not there to do the things you need to do. So one of the situations is maybe you need to have a contact person. Maybe you need to know what the emergency services are in that facility. And I know some people would say, well, I'm just doing smoking cessation. Yeah, that's true. But you're never going to know what may happen to that individual, and yet you're still responsible for that person as they kind of go through the process. Next standard was to verify the contact and the identity of the patient at each go. Clearly, this is, if you're doing video conferencing, you can see the patient. But if you're doing email, do you really know who you're emailing? And so you need to kind of verify who you're talking to. There's a horrific story where a psychologist was seeing a patient within a state, and it was an elder geriatric patient, and they're doing telepsychology within the state. The psychologist didn't know that the patient's caregiver was in the room. And what was happening was the caregiver was listening to what the patient was saying to the psychologist and using that against the patient and blackmailing her. So these things happen. So do you really now you need to know who else is in the room. And so what a lot of VA psychologists do is they'll take their video camera or device, and they'll just walk around the room like this to let the patient know that there's no one else there. And the same thing should happen for the patient so that you now know what's going on and you can ensure more confidentiality and the privacy of the discussion of the therapeutic hour. And then the final thing, the last number 14, was to discuss the limits of security and privacy. So that's where we were. We're trying at that point to kind of come up with an agreement among jurisdictions so we can try to get everyone to buy in and create this legal contractual fiction to make it work. What happened when we got there, every time we got to the point, it really didn't seem to make sense to do this. How are we going to ensure people to participate? How are we going to ensure that Minnesota would act on a case that's happening in Pennsylvania? What happens to the patient the Minnesota patient, to the Pennsylvania psychologist? How is that testimony going to be heard in the licensing board? Pennsylvania doesn't have the money to fly that person there, but yet if the person doesn't testify, there's no complaints and so forth. So there was good faith attempt to try to make that work. And so we next moved to what is a compact. So a compact really puts legal teeth to things. It's a legal obligation between states. The first major compact that you might know of is between New York and New Jersey, the Hudson River. It goes between both states. Who controls it? The Statue of Liberty is in the middle of the harbor. Is that in New Jersey or is that in Pennsylvania? Both claimed it. So by having a compact to decide how do you handle the Hudson River, how do you decide to handle the ownership of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island and so forth, the states were then agreed to those decisions between themselves. So it helps with economies of scale, helps to respond to national priorities like telepsychology, helping people across jurisdictions get the services they may need. And it also allows states to retain the state sovereignty, but also have shared sovereignty over a contractual relationship. And these are the things provided by the Council of State Governments, and they're an organization that kind of focuses on helping jurisdictions deal with and get through the compact. So let me talk a little bit about the historical perspectives about compacts. Compacts go way back in colonial days when the colonies were separate and there was a dispute. You'd send a message to the king would respond, and that's how disputes between the colonies were resolved. When the Constitution was adopted, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 says, "No state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state." So the Supreme Court held that, in fact, any doesn't mean all, and consent isn't required unless a compact infringes on federal supremacy. So that you don't need to have a compact of all 50 states. You can have it between 2 or 6 or 8 or 10, as long as they agree. And the federal government doesn't need to get involved unless it goes to federal law. Compacts basically then become a treaty between the states, which are enforceable. Now, you heard ASPPB is made up of the United States and Canada, and so our compact is just in the United States. It's not with Canada, because compacts can be, states can agree to it without the federal government, but once you talk with a foreign country, it's now legitimately a treaty, so you need to have the Senate approve it and the President sign it, and given what's going on in Washington, it's not a shot that anything's going to happen, and particularly something that they don't really care about, it's not tenable to kind of do that. However, the Canadians, ACPRO, are working on kind of a parallel process. So much like our CPQ, which allows people an expedited license from Minnesota to Ontario, it's not a treaty, but it's an agreement among all of us who accept the CPQ to facilitate that process. And that's kind of how this will kind of evolve. So they're binding on any state that applies, and conversely, they're not bound on any state that is not a signer to the compact. So that what happens is the state gives up some of its control over this individual, over this matter. So for example, let me back up. So once you agree to compacts, you have to accept it as is. You can't amend it, you can't modify it, you can't tweak it, you can't move a comma. You have to adopt it en masse and, if you want to be part of the compact. Yeah.
Does that mean ever?
Ever.
By mutual agreement?
Yes. The question is ever. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. But the short answer is yes. Ever. Forever. Or until the compact, if it has, compact is for 99 years. At the 100th year, it's no longer in effect. But yeah, it's forever. Okay. So this is what we talked about earlier. States give up some of their sovereignty to be part of this. The compact laws take precedent over a state as it pertains to this. So for example, if Minnesota wanted to join the compact, they'd have to abide by the inter-jurisdictional compact laws, but they would be free to still develop intra-jurisdictional telepsychological laws, which weren't because you have the sovereignty to do that. No one's going to usurp any state's authority to do that. And so there are about 200 compacts in the United States now. According to the Council of Governments, Minnesota has about 23. I talked a little bit about the Port Authority. Some compacts that you may know of is the Compact on Mental Health. So, for example, if you have someone that needs to be involuntary hospitalized, and there's no beds in your state to allow this, based on this compact, that person can be transmitted to a different state, and that state will hospitalize that person involuntarily among those compact states. Adult probation, if you have someone who's on probation after being released or parole after being released from prison, and they are in Pennsylvania and they want to move to Minnesota, there's a compact to allow that to happen, and Minnesota will pick up the probation and supervision part. And then the driver's license pack. You know, you can drive anywhere you want based on the license that you have. And unfortunately, there are 44 states that have a rule that says one driver, one license, one record. So if you get stopped for a ticket in one jurisdiction, if it's a compact state, your points or things will be notified to your state where your license is. So on the way here, in transparency, I got pulled over and got a ticket this morning because I was getting lost. And so I was in the middle lane, and the sign wasn't big enough, and I'm old, so I didn't see Energy Park Drive. So I discovered it late, and I put on my blinker and moved to the left turn lane, and then made the left turn. The officer said, "No, why are you making a turn from the middle lane?" So I got a ticket here. So hopefully Minnesota and Pennsylvania don't have a compact, so the points will... I'll pay the fine and move on. So let's talk about the nursing compact for a second. The nurses have a compact in 24 jurisdictions. It's fairly unique in that if you're licensed in one jurisdiction, you can temporarily practice in another jurisdiction as long as you don't move into that jurisdiction permanently. So if there's a North Dakotan who is licensed, a nurse who's licensed that wants to come across the border and practice in Minnesota, that person never has to get licensed in Minnesota because they're both compact states and they can live in North Dakota. And you can do that in Texas and the other states. And they were the first major mental health or healthcare compact, and they got up to 24, and then it kind of got stalled. And to answer your question specifically, one of the reasons it got stalled had to do with criminal record background check, had to do with discipline, had to do with funding and so forth. And so other jurisdictions aren't coming into the process because they don't want to accept the compact as it is written. And so what nursing is in the process of doing is exploring blowing up their compact and starting all over with a new compact to incorporate different laws and different rules, and starting the whole process all over again to redefine what practice is, what redefined how it's funded, to redefine criminal background checks is required, how where the discipline lies, and so forth. But no new jurisdictions have come aboard in the nursing in 10 years, and so nursing is in the process now of changing that. Other things that we can talk, other mental health or healthcare things that are being provided. Angelina said that you're the 8th state to do this. So the medical compact is different. They define the practice where the patient is. It's not a national license. It's not a national practice like what we're proposing for telepsychology. It's an expedited license. It's more similar to what I described as CPQ. So the medical license compact is, if you're licensed in North Dakota and you want to come to Minnesota, you can get an expedited license. You still have to get licensed in Minnesota. You still have to pay the fees. You still have to take the CEs. You still have to pay the renewal fees. But it's expedited on your license. And the way they set it up was as soon as 7 jurisdictions came into an existence and agreed, the compact would become live, and then they would have the commissioners made up of those states further define the regulations to implement the compact. So whereas what we're proposing, as you'll see, we're looking at a national practice for telepsychology. So that if you're licensed in Minnesota and you're part of a compact, then you could provide telepsychological services into any other compact state without being licensed in that jurisdiction. And the other thing is EMS, the emergency people, clearly if you're on the border state and there's an emergency right across, technically they're not licensed to go into that other jurisdiction to provide services. And it may be closer for them to do that than someone from the state may have to travel farther to provide those services. So they're developing a compact to allow for crossing borders to provide those services. Physical therapy is doing the same thing. I'm not quite sure how that's conceptualized yet. And social work, the reason there's a question mark, social work doesn't know what it wants to do. There was a meeting 2-3 weeks ago where they're just beginning to talk about the issue about should we have some type of compact among states or telepsychology or tele-mental health practice and so forth. But right now, the social work boards look at it. If you want to practice using the internet, you need to be licensed where you are, and you need to be licensed where the patient is. You need to be licensed both places. So why compacts? We talked about the e-passport was a fiction trying to get states to play nicely together in the sandbox. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it's kind of like herding cats, and it's difficult to do that. I know in my state, Pennsylvania, would say, we would love to have national licensure, as long as everyone agrees to what our laws are. And as soon as New Jersey agrees to what our laws are, we're going to change, because we can't do anything that New Jersey is in favor of. So that's kind of how states look at things. But we're trying to change that and to come up with a national model with the compact. And the compact then moves from playing nicely in the sandbox that if you want to be in the compact, there's certain rules and regulations that you need to apply. It's enforceable, it's flexible, it's not a fiction, it's binding on the states and the psychologist, and it also ensures that psychologists have the ability to provide these services and that the consumer is also being protected if something goes wrong with those services. So we talked a little bit about that. So let me generally tell you about what we're proposing is our compact, and then we'll go specifically through it before. So what we're looking at is, as I said, that a psychologist who's licensed in good standing in one compact state can practice interjurisdictionally into any other compact state without being licensed, provided they meet their requirements. The second thing that we're also suggesting is that there should be a temporary in-person face-to-face in that distant jurisdiction. So that if you're in, I guess, the western part of Minnesota, and North Dakota's further west, right across the river. Isn't there a river there, I think? I'm from the east, so this is all flyover. So if you want temporarily to go across the river and see a person physically face-to-face in North Dakota, you can do that under the compact, provided both are compact. And it's going to be up to 30 days, and that'll be determined by the commissioner. I'll get 1 second. And the reason why is the thought was, well, wait a minute, if we're allowing people to come in electronically without having a license, why wouldn't we allow people temporarily to come in? Your laws allow for expert witnesses to come in and testify, and that's not part of the practice of psychology. Most other jurisdictions don't have laws like that, so you need to be licensed to come in to be an expert witness. Or an IO person coming in needs to be licensed if you're, and so this will allow that. It's not intended for full-time practice. It's not going to usurp the authority of the licensing boards. It's not intended to set up a full-time private practice. It's there for temporarily services. In my opinion, if someone is going to be in a jurisdiction for a period of time, they need to be licensed in that jurisdiction. Yeah.
So that kind of answers the question of, I know people who have their primary practice, say, in Minnesota. During the winter, they go to Florida, Arizona, do a practice there, they do telepsychology across. But in that case, because it's more than 30 days, they would need to be licensed and fully licensed in both states.
Right. So the question was, you have the same issues that we do. So someone in Minnesota practices in the summertime here. When in the wintertime, they move to Arizona, or their patients do that, and now they continue the conversation telepsychologically. In my opinion, you're violating the laws of Arizona if you're not licensed in Arizona. If you're licensed in Arizona, then it's perfectly fine as long as Arizona and Minnesota says currently that you can provide that services now. But if you're here and your patient is Arizona and you're not licensed in Arizona, you're violating Arizona law. Well, currently. What this will do is deal with that, and so it will make that then a legal and ethical process to do that. That make sense? And that brings the other point on. So the compact will not apply in those situations where you're licensed in two jurisdictions like that. So if I was licensed in Minnesota and also in Arizona, and my patient went to Arizona for the winter, I could provide services to them because I'm licensed in both states, and so the compact really would not apply in that situation. Yes?
Does the 30-day thing allow for periodic visits over a longer period of time?
The question is, does it allow for periodic, or does it all have to be in one thing? That's yet to be determined, because the commission will put those things in, but I can answer it where I'm coming from, and hopefully I'll have some input into the process. If it's up to 30 days, let's say that number, you can do that however you see fit. 1 minute, however, counts as 1 day. Unlike Arizona, they have this bizarre, in my opinion, interpretation of the law. So they say you can practice for 30 days, but it's times 8 hours a day. So it's really, if you do the math, I did the math. It's on a different slide. 240. You can actually set up a full-time, part-time practice in Arizona, seeing someone every Monday for maybe 40 weeks without being ever licensed there. You couldn't do that in other jurisdictions because they look at it, 1 minute counts as 1 day. One contact counts as 1 day. But to answer your question specifically, you could do that. And so some people look at this as wonderful if they're working with college kids and they're going to a college in a different university, a different state. You can kind of maintain a relationship while they're away. Whereas now, it's probably not a good idea to do that because of the laws and so forth. So it also recognizes that the state have a vested interest in protecting the public. We talked about doesn't apply when both, and it's not intended to be a permanent practice. It's just temporary to allow that. If you intend to be there full-time, you need to get licensed there full-time. One of the difficulties that was raised earlier about how do you work with compacts, since it's language that's going to be there forever, you need to develop something that's general enough that it will have, it will allow a lot of people in, but it has to be specific enough so it'll have teeth involved in the process. You also have to, you don't want to develop the regulations so severe or the entrance into it so high so it limits the number of people coming in, and yet you don't want to have it so low that everyone can come in. So, because once the language is there, you're pretty much stuck with it, and that kind of goes back to the nursing compact language. So the frustrating part, remember MySpace? How many of you remember MySpace 10 years ago? That was it? MySpace doesn't exist now, or it does, no one uses it. So if you were to write things specifically about using MySpace as technology and it doesn't exist, you're out of luck. Last week in my nephew's graduation, they were all talking about Facebook, and my younger nephew, who's 15, looked at the college graduates and said, you guys are old school. No one uses Facebook now, it's all Instagram. So you have to be careful about how do you write the language and what vehicles to use and what platforms to use so it's broad enough to allow for technology to change in the future, but specifically enough to allow it to be enforced and to be regulated and to give teeth to what's going on. The other question we debated a lot was whether it's a doctoral level thing or a master's level thing. And our opinion was that it should be, because of the low to high thing, it should be for masters and above. The difficulty with that is if you're licensed independently, like Vermont, or some of the Minnesotans under the old laws are mastered as licensed on the independent level as a master's level. Licensed master's level folk at the independent level. If you're from that, you can only go into a state that will accept master's level licensure on the independent level. You can't go into a doctoral level compact state. And the primary reason for this has to do with due process and equal protection. If Arizona, for example, requires doctoral level, and now they're going to let master's level people come in, the people of Arizona, psychologists who are master's level that wanted to become licensed, now have a claim against the board and against the state for violating their due process and equal protection. So it's masters to master's level states, and doctorates can go from wherever they are to another jurisdiction. The goals of the PSYPACT increase public assessment, access, enhance protection, interstate cooperation among licensing boards and regulations, facilitate the exchange of information among boards. This is primarily important. So I talked earlier about the number of years you need to keep records. The other thing that frustrates me a lot has to do with psychologists can't agree on the definition of a year. It's true. Some jurisdictions just say that you need to have 1,500 postdoc hours. Some say 1,750, some say 2,000, some say 2,200. There's no empirical basis for those numbers. And so if you're licensed in a state that only required 1,500, and now you want to go to a state that required 2,000, that state isn't going to let you in because not that you're not competent. It has nothing to do with competency. It has to do you don't meet the regulations. And so again, what I would like to do if I were running the world, I'd put the numbers on the wall, throw a dart at it, and have all the states decide that was the number of postdoc hours or internship hours or whatever. Prior to 2001, some of you may remember, when you took the EPPB, there was about 63 different passage rates depending on which state you wanted to go to. Some looked at it standard deviation below the mean of first-time takers. Some looked at it as half a standard deviation for the means for all takers. And so what you had to do back then, and some used the Angoff method or a half Angoff method, which no one understood what that meant. But if you took the exam before 2001, you got a score, and then you have to figure out how you did compared to the other takers in the other states as to whether you're going to be able to go and meet their requirements based on your passage rates from the EPPB. 2001, all the states agreed to a common passport, with the exception of Georgia, because you get a few points off if you're a veteran, but other than that, all states have the same passport. Yes?
Just back a moment to what you just talked about. If you are a master's level but licensed as a psychologist in Minnesota, would it refer to master's to master level or psychologist?
It would refer to masters. So like if you're coming from Vermont or New Hampshire, which allow for independent practice in masters, and you wanted to come to Minnesota, which I think you got rid of the master's law that sunsetted, right? That's your grandfathered in, but you can't get masters going forward, right? So you're grandfathered in. You're still at Minnesota. Master's level folk is still a psychologist. Same in Pennsylvania. Master's level, who is licensed as a master's, is a psychologist. There's no different between a Ph.D. or a master's in Pennsylvania for that. But those laws have both been changed, and going forward, both states said you need to have a Ph.D. So if you're licensed as a master's in Minnesota and you want to go to, you would probably be limited to Vermont and New Hampshire, even though you're a psychologist and licensed independently, and it goes back to those due process questions. We're doing okay? Other questions? Okay. All right. So we talked mostly about this. So what do you need to do? Basically, if Minnesota is going to join the PAC, you need to provide temporary interpersonal. If Minnesota joins a PAC and you as a psychologist want to get a member of the PAC, then you can provide telepsychological services and face-to-face. So the key terms are, we talked a little bit, home jurisdiction is where the psychologist is, and you must identify where that practice is. The receiving state is where the the patient is located, and again, with the interjurisdictional practice, that would take precedent over. So North Dakota has a law that says we don't care where you are, but you first must come to North Dakota and have a face-to-face visit with the patient. Once you do that, you can provide telepsychological services wherever, never have to come back in North Dakota. If both of you were compact states, you wouldn't have to meet that requirement because of the compact. The other one is in distant jurisdiction. So the other twist to this is now when you're dealing with the temporary face-to-face, the practice is now where the patient is, because both of you are in that jurisdiction, and it makes sense conceptually to have the practice be defined where both of you are. Whereas the telepsychology, the practice is defined where you are. So how does it work? You need to have an e-passport. We talked about most of this. You need to attest background checks, comply with the laws of the commission. Educational requirements, you need to have a graduate degree. We're not talking about accreditation, just a graduate degree. It has to be regionally accredited. If you're from a foreign country outside the United States and Canada, it must be approved from a NACIS program. This is also in your law. It has to be a program psychologically in nature. And this is typical accreditation and designation language. This is nothing unusual. All graduate programs should have this. If not, it's not a psychology program. The other controversial thing has to do with residency. Different jurisdictions define residency different. Minnesota will allow for a more expansive definition of residency. Other jurisdictions are very restrictive as to what that means. So again, if you now lock in residency as very restrictive and the whole field moves to distant education and distant learning, people in the compact can't do that if they need to have typical face-to-face in the institution granting the situation. So that's part of the difficulty of drawing that, and that's kind of being left up to the commission to kind of figure out where the balance is in terms of having residency as part of the educational requirements for psychologists. So we talked a little bit, here are the requirements for licensure. You need to be licensed in a state. You can't have any discipline action, and this was a very big discussion. If you had some discipline action 10 years ago and your license is in good standing, why shouldn't you be eligible for it? And most jurisdictions kind of say, we don't want to accept anyone that has passed discipline if they're not coming into our state license. Now, let me stop here and make a point. This is just for the practice of telepsychology with one license into another jurisdiction where you're not licensed. You can go the old-fashioned way. You can go to that license and apply for licensure, and once you're licensed there, then you're eligible to practice there, as the example with Minnesota and Arizona. You can practice both places. This is only for the unique situation with one license to practice wherever you want interjurisdictionally. So you also need to have attestations of what your area of practice is. You're going to conform with the standards. You're going to perform, you're competent in technology, the criminal background check, that you have no discipline, no criminal activity. You're knowledgeable about the laws of both jurisdictions. You're going to allow for us to verify the information, to provide a data bank for the jurisdictions to allow that there's some type of vetting process so jurisdictions will feel comfortable that allowing people coming into practice into their jurisdiction without a license. You're going to be held to the guidelines which we talked about earlier. You're going to be held to the technology, ASPPB. You have to agree to be bound by the e-passport. Now, the e-passport won't exist in essence. It's just going to be kind of folded into the compact. But you'll have some type of certificate, and you can't hold yourself out as saying, I have this certificate I can practice e-passport, it's like an ABAP. No, it's basic service. So you can't misrepresent yourself by saying that you have the certificate, other than you have a certificate to allow you to practice into a different jurisdiction without a license. You need to come to ASPPB and let us know if you changed your address or have any discipline, so that we can help that. And licensing boards will have access to a data bank which will have who's coming into their state, and they'll have notice of that. They'll also have a data bank to kind of see if that person coming in has had any previous discipline or current discipline, to kind of help, again, to help the protection of the public. We talked about this. You need to inform your patient that what your status is and that you have a passport and you can provide this service. You need to also talk about conflicts with the patients, notify them about how you're going to deal with duty to warn and child abuse, what law applies, how you're going to handle it, and that's part of the informed consent process. ASPPB is going to, so the other thing here is we decided that you probably needed to have 6 hours of continuing education about the practice of telepsychology, whether that's technological, whether that's clinical practice, and we're in discussions with the insurance trust who have provided telepsychological service consultation. You know, Eric Harris and Jeff Youngren come around and give those talks. That would meet the criteria for the 6 hours of continuing education. And then you'd have to abide by any other rules that the commission came up. For denial, if you misrepresent yourself in any way, if you fail any one of the qualifications or you make false attestations to in your application process, you can be denied for that. Your passport can be revoked if there's fraud in the application, if there's public discipline, failure to comply, convicted of a crime, failure to comply with the policies and the procedures. So we talked about this, the home state controls. My time is running out, and I have more slides than I thought I needed. So we talked about this. The home state will control for the telepsych and for the temporary face-to-face, the distant receiving jurisdiction where the patient and the psychologist is, that will control. If in any one of the states that your license is revoked, suspended, any public reprimand, your e-passport, your certificate will immediately be revoked, and you will no longer be able to provide the services under the compact. Again, if that's the case, you can still go the old-fashioned way and apply to that licensed jurisdiction, so that the revocation may not prevent you from practicing in that other jurisdiction. That would be the other jurisdiction's call. ASPPB is not a jurisdiction. We don't have any due process. We're here to facilitate things. So all we can do is remove the passport. It's up to the jurisdictions then to look at the consequences and the egregiousness of the complaint as to whether then they may want to take individual action within that jurisdiction. We just talked about that. So for face-to-face, it's the same process. You need to be licensed in a jurisdiction, and you want to go provide services to face-to-face with a patient in another jurisdiction. This is something we call the IPC, which is the Inter-jurisdictional Practice Certificate, which is a document and certificate that 7 or 8 states now accept, where if I'm a forensic psychologist, for example, and I want to do testimony into a state, I can notify that state, and if I have an IPC, they'll let me in to practice, even though their laws may say that you can't come in. And here, that's not really an issue, but we're trying, again, to nationalize the process and have the same standards across the board so that you don't need to know where you can go in and where you can't go in. One of the let's do that. The same graduate education as before. The same requirements as before. The residency is the same thing. Same attestations. We talked about the scope of practice, and the receiving state is going to be in the distant jurisdiction. And again, if you're providing the services, the home state controls, but the receiving state, if they is a complaint filed from them, they can always file an injunction to suspend the practice under the temporary guidelines to stop the practice to protect the citizen of that jurisdiction. So like medicine, what psychology decided to do was to come up with a minimum of 7 states. When we have 7 states like medicine just did with the 8th state of Minnesota, the compact will become live, and then those first 7 or 8 states or 10 states will then develop the regulations to implement the compact. And as more jurisdictions come in, they'll have to adopt to those jurisdictions, those requirements. If you now get 25 or 30 states and there's a new majority, then that new commission, made up of all the compact states, can then kind of revise the regulations within the compact. They can't change the language of the compact. It's kind of like your licensing law in Minnesota. Only the governor and the legislators can change the licensing law. The regulations, the board has a lot more ability to change regulations, to offer regulations, to implement the law. For example, Minnesota couldn't say tomorrow, the psych board couldn't say tomorrow, we're going to have prescriptive authority in our law because it's not in the act. Only the legislature could put it in the act. Once it's in the act, then the board, in consultation with everyone else, would come up with regulations to implement prescriptive authority. Questions? Great question. So usually when I talk, and I talk about psychology, I say this will not happen in my lifetime. However, this is going to happen. From what medicine, 2 years to get 8 states. I think we'll probably take a little longer. It probably will take 2 legislative cycles. I would imagine within the next 4 to 5 years, we'll have 7 to 8 states that will, and the compact will go live. Right. The question is, using the radiologists are now in Dubai looking at films, and radiologists love interjurisdictional practice, but primary physicians don't because it's hands-on and it doesn't really help them, which is why medicine did what they did. The question is, if I'm in one state looking at MMPI from a lot of other states, can I do that? I think that's correct. You could do that. One of the things that you can't do with the compact is this is a hub and spoke. So if you're in Minnesota and that's your home state, you can go this way. If another compact state is Arizona and you want to get out of the winter here and go there for the summer, you can't start everything from Arizona to go out in the spoke thing. It only can emanate from Minnesota to other states. And the primary reason for that is you're not licensed in Arizona. So it has to follow where discipline follows. And so you can start here, you can see someone in Arizona, but you can't be from Arizona unless you're licensed there and declare that your home state. Yes?
So a more, maybe, frequent scenario in Minnesota, I have a patient here, sometimes they go to Arizona or another state for part of the year, and I can do telemedicine there, and I can do a certain number of days being there where I can be there. What about if they stay in Minnesota and I go to Arizona, they're still in Minnesota, I'm a Minnesota licensed person?
And wrong answer. No. I'm not making fun, but no. You'd have to be here because you're not licensed in Arizona. So the example that I use a lot, I'm in Pennsylvania, so we also have patients that go to the winter in Florida, and I see patients occasionally when they come back up and in emergency situations there. So if I decide to vacation in Florida, where my patient is vacationing or living 6 months, it's basically a Pennsylvania psychologist talking to a Pennsylvania patient in Florida. Has nothing to do with the state of Florida, except the state of Florida would say you're practicing psychology without a license, even though it has nothing to do with them. And so that's the answer to the question. Yes?
So I've been clear, so I am a snowbird, and I do go to Arizona, and I sometimes talk to patients back there. That's illegal.
So I'm an attorney, but I'm not licensed to practice in Minnesota.
Thank you, Alex.
Not to give advice. The answer is you should talk to the board. Should talk to other people here. The answer is yes and no. I mean, I'm not making light of it. But if you're not licensed in Arizona and you're practicing in Arizona with Minnesota State things, Arizona could have a problem with that. Now, most jurisdictions aren't, the overwhelming majority of jurisdictions aren't going to go looking for things. They can only respond to those things that are brought before them. So, had the cop not been at that corner today, did I violate the law? But the cop was there. So that's probably how I'd answer that. Other? Yeah.
You said a couple of things earlier. In some situations, you said in an emergency that trumps other
Right.
things. If I'm on vacation in Colorado and a patient calls me on my cell phone, he has no idea where I am, and he says, I feel like killing myself, I could certainly tell him to call 911 without.
Yep, and so the question is, I'm running out of time. So the question is, what happens with emergency situations?
Yeah, I mean,
Currently. So generally speaking, emergencies trump laws. So that in that situation, you can have a conversation potentially with the patient. You can call 911. You can even kind of have a conversation talking with them, because it's an emergency situation. I'd be careful as to your definition of emergency, however. Suppose you have a patient, child, 13, 14, that's in an unfortunate situation where both parents hate each other, and they're now separating and or divorced, and they're putting the kids in the middle. And every 3 or 4 months, there's an emergency situation because dad's doing something that mom doesn't like, and they're calling you. The first time probably is an emergency. The 6th, 7th, 8th time that you get that emergency call probably isn't an emergency. Because that's unfortunately, that's kind of the pattern that's being set up. So, yeah, the answer is you probably could, but I would talk to the licensing board here to make sure. I'd look to your rules and regs to see what they talk about emergency situations. But generally speaking, most jurisdictions would allow that.
And generally, the other situation of somebody called, wants to change an appointment, I have to be in Colorado or Arizona, tell them, call me back.
So the question is, what happens if it's not emergency? It's just more administrative. It depends how you define that. Some people would define talking to a patient as practice. Some jurisdictions may differentiate administrative from clinical. You'd have to look to the boards where you are and where the patient is as to what that is. I mean, there was some person that I respect a whole lot when we first started talking about this, from Alabama, and I won't mention his name, but very well respected psychologist. When we talked about telephone, he basically said, "What are you kidding me? I've been talking to patients for 40 years on the telephone, and I'll be damned if you're going to take the phone out of my hand." You're right, but technically, across jurisdiction, you could be practicing without a license. Sir.
Yes, can you cover confidentiality limitations by listing the limitations in your informed consent, such as email is not secure, Skype is not secure?
What was the part? I understand. What was the question?
Can you adequately cover the
Yeah.
confidentiality limitations by listing them in your
Gotcha.
informed consent, which would then allow you to use Skype and allow you to use email? If you let them know that they're not secure, that they can be hacked.
I think part of that question is yes, you can do that. And your informed consent deal with all that stuff. The difficulty that I have, and I'm not, generally speaking, is I don't know that you can inform consent certain things. Like, for example, if Skype isn't HIPAA compliant, I don't think that you can, in your informed consent, say, let's disavow HIPAA and it's okay because you're consenting it to it. Much like, and pardon me to go to the extreme here, if you've in your informed consent said, hey, we're two mutual adults, we can have a sexual relationship if we want. We're both over 21. It's in my informed consent. If you're willing and I'm willing. So there's some things you can't put in an informed consent that would buy that, but I think most of the other stuff about emails and how your practice is, as long as it conforms to the law, that you're okay. But I don't think you can put things that would be violative of the law in an informed consent.
So if you were, if you were a young student just starting out, what three pieces of advice would you give that young student? Potentially working, kind of how during your career, think about this, because that's very different.
I agree. And that was one of the frustrating parts for us in developing this. You have to develop telepsychology for people like me that are never going to use it, and that are digital immigrants. You have to develop it to digital natives that are going to use it full time. And then you have to deal with everyone else in the middle who think they know about it, but really don't know anything about it, but they want to use it because they can make money with it. And so it's a broad cast to cover those three groups. But to answer your question, the first thing I would tell them is credential your bank, your credentials, so that it's secure as you kind of go forward. The second thing I would tell them, depending on where they are in the process, one of my frustrations with most PsyD and Ph.D. programs, they only teach to graduation. They don't teach to licensure. So we don't have what it means to, what do you need to do to get licensed. We don't talk about how do you set up the business aspects of this profession. So when I was growing up in psychology, you couldn't talk about business. You couldn't talk about how to make a living. You know, and psychologists have said, I'm here to help people. I'm not here to make money. There is a very well-known Minnesota psychologist that's not here, Bravada, yeah, who would always say, what's her line? This girl needs the money. And I'm in the CAP meeting where she's at, and she always says that. So that's the second thing, to talk about the business aspects, talk about what you need to do about licensure. And the third thing is I would tell them is to kind of figure out what they want to do and to kind of develop a niche, whatever that means, and then kind of pursue that. And then, so those are the three things how I would go about doing it. Last question? Sure.
So I know we've been talking about inter-jurisdictional, but currently if you are doing any kind of telepsychology intra-jurisdictionally, insurance companies typically will not reimburse for that. Do you see that changing?
Yes. So the question was, insurance companies don't reimburse for intra. That is beginning to change. Pennsylvania the insurance companies are going to do that. For Medicaid and Medicare, you can do that intra, but it's very restrictive. You got to be in a certain site, and the other patient has to be in a certain site, and so forth. But it's my belief, I'm speaking for me here, not ASPPB or anybody else. You know, it's kind of like the movie, if you build it, they will come. If you set up a mechanism that's working, I think then the insurance companies will have to follow and reimburse. So I think you'll see that more and more. And then the question becomes, will it be valued more as a higher rate, or will it be valued less because you don't need an office and you don't have all the other overhead? And the people that I talk to are mixed about that as to where that's going to fall down. Thank you very much.
Sure. All right. There it is. All right. Let's see. Good. All right. Well, thank you, Alex, about your remarks on PSYPACT. It's exciting. We hope that this presentation will begin the conversation for Minnesota. And to the insurance point, I think that as the board partners with licensees and other organizations and stakeholders, the insurance piece is going to be a critical piece of the equation to work in as we move in this direction, because obviously the time is valuable and the reimbursement is also important. So it's time for our break. We're going to release you for a quick break here, but if we could come back, we're going to try and hit for 9:45. Actually, let's do 9:50. If you can be really prompt back at 9:50, we'll get started, and we'll have more content for you just then. Welcome back. As Dr. Siegel talked about, geography and physical description of boundaries have historically shaped how we view communities and how we construct society and our healthcare services. As we heard from Dr. Siegel, the importance of geography is shifting, though, as physical boundaries diminish and the use of technology increases. But even with the use of increased technology, access to healthcare services in rural versus urban areas remains a concern. A telling piece of this concern is that rural residents, on average, are poorer, older, and for those under age 65, less insured than those living in urban areas. According to an article entitled Geography and Disparity in Health by Dr. Thomas C. Ricketts, one of the most important geographic features that may affect health status and health outcomes, which may contribute to disparities, is distance to healthcare. The PSYPACT offers legal and manageable ways to try and bridge the gap between healthcare and consumers. As the board and Minnesota psychologists consider the PSYPACT, it will be important to keep in mind the expanded access to care that this option provides, along with the critical aspects of public protection. As we move into our next session, this is going to take us in a little different direction, away from legal, regulatory, and clinical complexities of interjurisdictional practice and geographic boundaries, and into the board's complaint resolution process. The foundation of this program is to expose licensees to the board's process for resolving complaints. The substance of complaints considered today are going to take us beyond the discussions about professional relationships and boundary violations. One, a strong understanding about the process of investigation and resolution of complaints for the Board of Psychology. Two, knowledge about the board's mechanism for addressing mental or physical impairment of licensees who may be practicing without reasonable skill and safety due to a mental or physical condition. Three, information about an additional resource for assistance to those facing challenges related to impaired practice. And four, the legal basis for the board's complaint resolution process and legal concepts that drive the board's actions. So we'll start our session today with a little bit of audience participation here. How many people in the audience today have participated in a role play before? All right. How many people's role plays were absolutely identical to having a real session with a client? That's what I thought. So we're going to have the same situation here, and some of the ways that you're going to observe this meeting over here of the Minnesota Board of Psychology Complaint Resolution Committee and its staff will be purposes for the role play only. So I just want to make the audience aware that the primary example of how this meeting, as we sneak in and take a peek on it, will be different is that the investigator and the board staff in this role play today are going to give the full details and facts of the case in a very formalized way. That's for the benefit of the audience so that you guys too can know what the case materials contained and are ready to discuss the issues without such a limited knowledge of the facts. Typically, when they come to the meeting, the cases have already been reviewed. They're very familiar with the facts, and we wouldn't do this full recitation that the investigator will provide. So here's where it gets a little non-traditional. As you might remember from last year, or for those of you who are new, this is the part where I take the audience behind the scenes of the Complaint Resolution Committee meeting. You're going to observe the committee as it triages cases, and it's going to conduct a disciplinary conference with a licensee. Usually, however, these meetings are closed to the public. Minnesota Government Data Practices Act is dictating that these meetings remain closed. It's also important under data practices that we understand that this data is classified as confidential. The purpose behind this requirement of confidentiality is linked to due process and equitable considerations. So it's important when we're thinking about confidentiality and the complaint resolution process to remember that most of these complaints in front of the committee are unsubstantiated. The board on average receives about 130 complaints a year, and of those, about 90% of them are dismissed without board action. It's important when we think about this that if the board were to conduct an investigation of complaints and make all of that investigative data available to the general public, this can have a significant impact, as you might imagine, on licensees' careers, reputations, and business overall. The law is also concerned about undue influence on the process and preserving the investigative space of the board free from outside influence. So although our goal today is to get an authentic view of the Complaint Resolution Committee working through their meeting, sometimes during the course of the Complaint Resolution Committee meetings, the team will consult with a Minnesota attorney. The committee needs to consult with a Minnesota attorney in order to determine the legal basis for pursuing the complaint, for any disciplinary remedy that it wishes to pursue or corrective action. And the committee's attorney usually represents the committee in both an investigative and overall complaint resolution process. This is an assistant attorney general from the Office of the Attorney General's Office Health Licensing Division, but today the committee won't have an assistant attorney general present to answer its questions. So I'm going to serve as that resource, but I don't want you to be confused. I do have a license to practice in Minnesota, so I feel fairly confident about that, but I want to provide you with a sort of a warning here that the information I'm providing isn't to be considered legal advice. And so I have prepared that disclosure in full. Here we go. The information contained herein in the handouts, documents, slides, comments, skit reenactments, and throughout the duration of this conference do not form an attorney-client relationship. The information heretofore is provided for educational purposes only, and your consideration and independent analysis by individuals with education, experience, and training sufficient to make independent clinical judgments regarding your own practice. Your participation in this conference is deemed voluntary, and you assume all risks associated with such participation, including and limited to increased understanding, a significant proliferation of endless complex questions, a general confusion as to why anyone consults a lawyer anyway. Additional side effects may include excitement over new content and a general desire to reassess one's practice and responsibilities that relate to impairment and ethical dilemmas. Please contact your medical provider if this disturbs you. All right. Whew. In addition to my dreams of being a legal radio announcer and the person, some of you might remember from last year that I have this ability to freeze the meeting on a specific word and to unfreeze it as needed. This is going to allow me to talk you through in case we miss anything or to explain the finer points of the meeting. So as the committee works through their meeting, I'm going to use the word read, as I did last year, and this is going to freeze meeting participants. And I'm certain, absolutely certain, that every lawyer in the state of Minnesota covets the ability to do this whenever they need to throw out some legal advice. Not really sure, though, that anybody else would be able to talk. So we probably should check in first to see if this works. And we want to know that our words work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for your help. I'm going to count to 3, and on 3, I want you to say read. We'll give it a shot. So 1, 2, 3. Red. Ah, perfect. Absolutely. Okay. Guess it works. Green. And that's how I'm going to release them. All right. So before I forget, if you have any questions as we go along, you have your card at your spot. We really encourage you to write out your question and pass it to our staff members who will be watching. Stick it up, and they'll come grab it, and we can bring those up and get the questions answered. But before we peek in on the meeting, let me tell you a little bit about the committee itself and its membership and process. The board has 2 complaint resolution committees that review complaints on behalf of the board. The committees meet once every other month on a rotational basis. Each committee is made up of 2 psychologist members and with 1 public member, and we strive for the greatest level of diversity on those committees that we can, both in gender and in practice, in other ways as well. And within the psychologist membership, we typically, given that we have a high level of custody complaints, You know, when you have a custody dispute, typically somebody loses and somebody's mad and somebody's to blame. I think they pick you guys. And so we do get those complaints quite frequently, and we want to make sure that someone on the panel has forensic experience. So I'm going to introduce our committee today. The first member of the committee is Dr. Patricia Stankovich. Dr. Stankovich was the former secretary of the board, member of the administrative committee, and currently serves on the application review and complaint resolution committees. We also have Dr. Raja David. Dr. David is a doctoral level psychologist member of the board, as well as vice chair of the board and member of the administrative complaint resolution and rules committee. The final member of our committee is Dr. Scott Fisher. Dr. Fisher is a doctoral level member of the board, as well as chair of the board, member of the administrative, professional responsibility exam, and complaint resolution committees. We definitely get our $75 a day from all of them. Also in the room today are staff members. Scott Payne is our compliance director. He's in charge of internal investigations of the board and oversight of the program for investigations and complaint resolution. Josh Bramley is our compliance specialist who assists in case creation, complaint triage, and manages licensee compliance with disciplinary or corrective action orders. Now we know who the players are. I'm going to add that the complaints that the committee will consider today will talk about licensee impairment, investigative tools and processes for provider-related impairment issues, and diversion programs such as the Health Professional Services Program. Just briefly, the primary goal of the Health Professional Services Program here is to prevent, actually to allow for early intervention, diagnosis, and treatment for individuals who may have an impairment. Those monitoring services are typically in lieu of board discipline. However, there's several ways that I believe the meeting members will address today on how you get to HPSP and how it's used. So to make sure we're ready, I'm going to let you in on what's on the agenda here. The committee, once it convenes, will be taking on triage first. The committee has reviewed the case materials at home and has provided evidence in a case summary that will identify the facts of the case and the potential violations that have been identified by staff. As they come together in this meeting, they're going to clarify their questions, discuss the case, and make a decision as to what to do next. Do they need more information on the complaint? Do they want to have an educational conference? Or do they wish to have a disciplinary conference? The goal of an ed conference is to see if the issue can be easily remediated. And finally, if it's a disciplinary conference, the licensee will be sent a formal notice to appear, telling them what the allegations are, what the committee wishes to discuss, and when to appear. So let's see if we can catch a little bit of triage.
Well, it looks like we're all organized and ready to start. We've got a pretty full agenda, so I'm going to call the meeting to order. We've got one licensee coming in today to meet with us and several cases to triage. Since our licensee won't be here for a little while, how about if we start with some triage?
Sounds good. Sure. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming in on such a nice day, as being a top 10 weather day today. If you remember, this case is dealing with the licensee, Ashton Kent, who, while experiencing high levels of stress, would numb out during these times. The board received evidence from Mr. Kent's therapist that during periods of high level of stress, he would either disassociate or pass out to manage what is going on. In July of 2014, the licensee was taken to detox after police found him intoxicated in a bar with a blood alcohol level of 0.248. He was admitted to inpatient treatment. In early December 2014, the licensee was convicted of a gross misdemeanor, third degree driving while impaired, and sentenced to only 6 years of supervised probation. The case came to the board's attention in February 2015. A third party reported that the licensee was found passed out in his vehicle with a high blood alcohol level. The licensee had been on his way home from work after conducting an evaluation of a prison inmate. The evaluation triggered his own trauma, which led him to purchase a bottle of Jack Daniels, which he drank on the drive home. And that's for the committee. If you want to discuss it here.
So it looks like there's a number of potential alleged violations. I'm wondering if we should maybe review what those might be first.
Well, in this case, we're looking at allegations of unprofessional conduct and provider impairment for the alcohol abuse and the disassociation, and incompetency and impaired objectivity for conducting these evaluations that cause such high stress.
Okay, thank you, Josh. So it looks like there seems to be a pattern here. What are you thinking, Dr. David and Dr. Fisher?
Is it correct that this licensee has never come before us?
That's correct.
That's correct, okay.
Well, there's a number, there's multiple incidents of alcohol abuse, and the other thing that is concerning is that it seems to be very directly related to his work.
It does.
You know, that one of these incidents occurred immediately after doing an evaluation, and the information that we have suggests that it was related to his own trauma.
Mhm.
So that, to me, raises the level of concern higher about his ability to practice safely.
Yeah, it does for me too, and I'm wondering also, is he missing a lot of work? You know, what's happening when he's feeling triggered? You know, is he able to actually do a unbiased, objective evaluation at all?
I concur with all that and just wonder also about how judgment's being impacted given these incidents occurring with him being in the car and drunk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you think we should do?
I don't think we've got much choice other than bring him in for a notice of conference on the violations that we've talked about.
Yeah, it seems like we need a little bit more information in terms of, you know, what's really happening here too, and how safe is he?
I agree. I think we should notice him.
Okay.
Red. The committee's beginning to explore a process about bringing in the licensee. A representative remedy for this type of situation for the board would be, in general, the board may issue a 12-month suspension of the license, require that the licensee demonstrate sobriety for 12 months, provide self-reports to the board, provide evidence of treatment and participation in a chemical dependency rehabilitation program. They may need to prove weekly attendance at a chemical dependency support group, or demonstrate that they've remained compliant with physical and mental health recommendations from treatment providers or other assessments that have been done. They also may, because this involves legal implications with the DWI, is we may be seeking information as a board from the court, which might include a report from a probation officer. And in conclusion, in order to lift the suspension, the board would likely seek a fitness for duty evaluation and commit to compliance with the evaluator's recommendations. So for example, if they underwent that evaluation and additional follow-up or restricted practice was recommended, the board would take those factors into consideration. Green. Looks like they're about ready for their next case. Red. At each CRC meeting, the agenda consists of 3 types of matters, and we just saw triage. So now we're going to go to conferences, meetings with the licensees, which can either be educational or disciplinary. As we look at the compliance in this case, and we move towards this disciplinary conference, we're going to go ahead and see what's next. Green.
Well, our licensee, Dr. Bennett, is going to be here in about 15 minutes, so why don't we take a break from triage and review that case, make sure we're all on the same page and ready.
Sounds good. So I'll go over just the case real quick before the licensee joins us. Dr. Garrett Smith is a Minnesota licensed psychologist who works at ABC Clinic, Counseling Town, Minnesota. His offices primarily provide services to adults with depression and anxiety. ABC Clinic is made up of 4 psychologists. Dr. Smith wrote the board with concerns about one of his fellow colleagues, Dr. Bennett, who is also a licensed psychologist. Dr. Bennett, who has worked for ABC Clinic since 2011, but over the past year, Dr. Smith had noticed changes in her work product and her demeanor. Dr. Bennett is consistently behind on her paperwork, including the writing of progress notes, and it was reported and confirmed that she is several weeks behind on termination summaries and report writing following psychological assessments. ABC Clinic has been getting complaints from patients that Dr. Bennett does not call them back or return emails. One specific client was identified and the records were subpoenaed. This client complained that she requested her records from Dr. Bennett on January 15, 2015, and still has not received them. The investigation confirmed that Dr. Bennett received the request, but has not yet provided those records to the client. During the course of his interview with me, Dr. Smith said he was worried about Dr. Bennett. Dr. Smith also described Dr. Bennett as seeming to be in another place or extremely stressed. Dr. Bennett's response to me said she has a lot going on in her personal life and mentioned that specifically her children are a source of stress and seems to be getting worse. At the beginning of March, Dr. Smith met with Dr. Bennett to talk about concerns at work with her practice and her ability to continue to work. He reported that Dr. Bennett's extremely defensive about being behind at the clinic. Dr. Smith reported in his interview with me that he reviewed 5 charts with Dr. Bennett and the work that remains overdue. According to Dr. Smith, Dr. Bennett promised to show that she was going to catch up with her work, but that she was just only stressed. Dr. Bennett continued, however, during the course of her interview with me and in her inquiry letter to the state that it has been difficult to keep up given that she is juggling multiple responsibilities at home. It is also worth noting that Dr. Bennett mentioned her past struggles with depression. Dr. Smith documented for the board 26 files that are behind on progress notes by more than 2 weeks. I also substantiated that Dr. Bennett has multiple reports that are overdue. Through Dr. Bennett's own reports and the interview with Dr. Smith, the issue of Dr. Bennett's focus and concentration during staff-to-staff interactions appears to be diminished. The committee should note that Dr. Smith reported in his information to the board that he repeatedly tried to get another psychologist at ABC Clinic to report their observations about Dr. Smith to the board, but the psychologist, Andrea Midas, refused to report what she observed. Dr. Smith was clear that Dr. Midas saw impairment, but she didn't feel like it was her role to interfere since it was not during office hours. And I did attempt to contact Dr. Midas about this, but I was unsuccessful.
Red. If you remember from introductions, Josh is the compliance specialist, and he's charged with identifying potential allegations for the committee to consider. However, the board uses its expertise of the psychologists here on our panel for matters that are psychological in nature. So next, you're going to see Josh run through the allegations that can be explored at the disciplinary conference with the licensee. He'll highlight the areas that the committee might want to focus their questioning on. Red. Oh, how about green?
Josh, before we review the potential allegations here, there's one thing that I've been wondering about. Scott, you just mentioned about Dr. Midas and how the complainant had said that she had seen impairment, but she didn't really want to report it. And so I'm wondering, don't we have a rule that a licensed psychologist needs to report impairment? And what do we do in this case about Dr. Midas, if anything?
Licensed psychologists are mandated to make a report to the board when they observe impairments of other psychologists. And that report, a report to HPSB is another option they could use to fulfill that requirement.
Okay. So we can't really talk about that here, right, in this particular situation?
I will take that into consideration, and more than likely it will be investigated as a separate complaint.
Great, thank you. So could we go through the violations?
So we have unprofessional conduct. The licensee engaged in unprofessional conduct or conduct which has a potential for causing harm to the public, including departure from or failure to conform to the minimum standards of acceptable and prevailing practice. The licensee has demonstrated an inability to practice psychology with a reasonable skill and safety due to any mental or physical illness or condition, including but not limited to substance abuse or dependence. Provider shall not the provider shall practice services that they can provide competently. We also have an issue of accessing and releasing private information, a failure to provide access to a client's records, and record keeping that does not meet the minimum standard.
And as we review the evidence, keep in mind we need the preponderance of the evidence, which is generally in terms 51% more true than not true, to substantiate any allegations in any case. Subpoena, the evidence I'll go over real quick again that was presented. We got the subpoena client records, including incomplete case reports, testing summaries, and unfulfilled requests for records. We have the client written request for her records. We have the interview with Dr. Smith. We have Dr. Bennett's written response to the board for this conference. And we have Dr. Bennett's personnel file from her employer, including the performance improvement plan. So with that evidence available to you.
Red. As the committee members prepare for the conference, they're focusing on the notice that was actually provided to Dr. Bennett prior to her arrival at the conference today. They can use that document as the sole parameters for what they discuss in the case. Now, should Dr. Bennett bring up any additional matters in her conversations with the board, she's provided with preliminary warnings. However, any information that she voluntarily supplies to the board can be discussed as well. But in general, the board committee members are limited to what's contained in the notice for due process considerations. The members won't be able to cover everything that's provided in the notice, but they will focus on their biggest concerns and try and get information that'll help them make a decision in the case. Information provided by the licensee can be incredibly helpful to the committee as they consider the complaint. The committee really takes into consideration how a licensee responds to an issue. Everybody makes mistakes, and everybody has issues in their practice, and the board doesn't expect otherwise. However, managing those are a part of demonstration of competence, so it can make the difference in discipline or no discipline, remembering that our key focus is public protection. And the key question being, is Dr. Bennett safe to practice? Green.
Well, it looks like we have come up with a pretty good list of questions here for Dr. Bennett. Does anyone have any final questions to add to the list? Are we all ready to meet with her? Yeah, I guess we're ready for the licensee.
Sure.
Red. The committee's ready to invite her in, and her attorney if she has one. Usually the board staff and the 3 committee members and a representative of the Attorney General's office are present at this disciplinary conference. And here we're going to have the opportunity to hear from the licensee, get her perspective, and understand the process behind her actions. Green.
Well, if we're ready for Dr. Bennett, I'll go get Dr. Bennett.
That'd be great, Scott.
Thank you.
Wish me luck.
Good luck.
Morning, Dr. Bennett.
Hi, I'm Dr.
Could this come this way?
Thank you.
Got a lovely chair over here waiting for you,
Oh, right here.
next to Dr. Stankovich.
Thank you.
Would you like a glass of water or anything?
Oh, no, I'm fine, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Bennett.
Good morning.
Red. In a disciplinary conference, there's formalities that are done by the Attorney General's office for the committee. It's going to include an introduction to the process, a notice that the conference is being recorded, and the data that's collected in that recording can be used in a later proceeding should they not reach a settlement during this conference. Then we'll proceed with voice identifications for the record, along with an explanation of the process. Dr. Bennett is allowed, if she would like, to make an opening statement to the committee, and then the committee will proceed with its questioning. At the end of the questioning, when there's no other questions by committee members or staff, Dr. Bennett is given an opportunity to make a closing statement. When she finishes her closing statement, if she chooses to make one, she's dismissed for the deliberations of the committee. Let's check in and see how it's going to go. Green.
Well, Dr. Bennett, thank you so much for coming in this morning. We appreciate it. Did you wish to make an opening statement before we begin?
No, I thought I'd just to answer whatever questions you have, so.
Okay, great. The committee has had a chance to review the materials that you've sent back to us. You did a really thorough job in terms of answering the questions in the letter of inquiry. We appreciate that. We do have a number of other questions for you today. We have some follow-up questions, and we hope you bear with us that we may be asking you some of the same questions that you've already provided us an answer to in writing. We want to make sure that we have all the facts and that we get your take on what the situation is from your perspective as well. And so we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So with that, we're going to begin. We each will be questioning you. We have a variety of things that we want to follow up on. And a good place to start oftentimes is if you could tell us a little bit about your practice, including what you've been doing at ABC Counseling.
Sure. Well, I'm really a generalist. I work at ABC Clinic, as you know, and there's 3 other colleagues. I'm the 4th one, and I see children, mainly adults though, for mental health problems. Kind of do diagnostics, assessment, therapy, kind of the usual stuff.
Can you say a little bit about how work has gone for you over the past year, Dr. Bennett?
Yeah, well, I'm really good at what I do. I've gotten a lot of certifications throughout the years. I could do CBT, I do ACT. I just went to a conference on a tele-health, and so I've done, I'm pretty versatile. What was the question again?
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, but if you could just say a little bit more, how has work been for you this past year?
Sure. I'm under, I have a lot of stress in my life, and that's just what this is all about. It's really just been stress.
Would you be willing to share with us a little bit about that stress?
Well, you know, I have a lot on my plate right now. I have, me and my husband are separated right now, and we have a couple of kids, and one of my kids has some medical issues, and there's a lot of appointments between, you know, the medical appointments, and then I had surgery. So we just have a lot of appointments, and then lawyer bills, and meanwhile at work they just keep pushing, you know, productivity, see more patients, get more people in, all that.
Well, it certainly does sound like there's a lot of stressful parts of your life. What's your sense of how that's impacted your work?
Well, you know, I really, I have a lot of paperwork. I do really thorough reports, and I take pride in my work. It takes a lot to get all the research and do all of that to put into my reports. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Well, let me maybe go more specifically to some of the things that have been alleged here. It's alleged that you're behind in your paperwork. Can you speak to that specifically?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've gotten a little bit behind in my work. You know, I see a lot of patients, and so, and again, I do those really thorough reports, so it takes time to get all the information from, you know, schools and collateral to put into my report. But, you know, I'll get them done.
Would you, though, agree as we're sitting here now, you are behind?
Yeah, I'm a little bit behind.
And more so than what we'd expect as a standard practice of care?
Well, I'm not sure what that is, but I suppose compared to colleagues, I'm more behind.
So somewhat relatedly, it's also been alleged that you have not followed through on phone calls to some of your clients. Can you speak to that?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay, so I have a few patients who call all the time. And if I return all those phone calls, I literally wouldn't be able to do anything else in a day. So I just figure, you know, if they have something going on, they just need to schedule an appointment, come in, and I'll talk to them then. But yeah, the phone call thing, I don't have time for that. I've got way too much on my plate right now.
So we all have clients like that might frequently call us. Have you thought of any other strategies for managing those kind of folks?
Well, I suppose I just need some time to think about that a little bit more, but yeah. Maybe, you know, have them come into the clinic more often or something like that. So.
You've mentioned a variety of stressors in your life right now.
Yes, I'm very stressed.
It sounds like you do have a lot on your plate, and I am just wondering if your work were impacted by all those stressors in your life, what would that look like? How would you know?
Well, you know, I would hope people would tell me. You know, one of my good friends, Dr. Midas, works with me, and she's never said anything to me. And I would think that folks would tell me, you know, I think stress impacts everybody. I mean, you know, you have stress, I'm sure, in your lives, right?
Sure, we all have stress.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
So it kind of, I'm sure it impacts, you know, you kind of get distracted or have a hard time concentrating sometimes, so.
Well, it looks like there was a meeting early in March with Dr. Smith about some performance issues. Could you tell us what was your understanding of what was discussed at that meeting and what was the outcome of that meeting?
Yes, Dr. Smith. Now that may be somebody who has no stress and just can focus on work all the time. But he has very high, I would say unreasonable standards. But we talked about, I am behind, and I need to get caught up. And so we kind of went through all the cases that I'm behind on, and I agreed to get caught up on those cases. So, and I'm working on it. Yeah.
You've mentioned the stress in your life
Yes.
several times, and you talked about it generally, separation and some medical problems. Could you give us a little bit more detail on exactly what's going on?
Yeah, me and my husband are working out custody issues right now. I mean, he's not nearly as good of a parent as I am, and so we have lawyers and we're going through court for that, and I just, I still have a lot of pain and problems, with my knee after surgery, and I used to, exercise a lot, and that was one of the ways that really helped me with stress and my mood and stuff like that, and I haven't been able to exercise now. So, yeah, just a lot of stress,
So one of the other things that was reported to us is that colleagues were concerned about their interactions with you, that you didn't seem the same, that you seemed to be struggling with concentration, those kinds of things. Can you tell us a little bit about that from your perspective?
Well, I don't, my colleagues haven't said anything to me, but what I would say is, I don't have time for them anymore. I mean, I have to get caught up on all these reports, so I'm sure that, I appear more distant, or, I don't have time to just sit around the lunchroom anymore and just, chat with them. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure that bothers them, but I've got to get my work done.
You've said a couple times that nobody has said anything to you.
Yeah.
But of course,
yeah.
Dr.
Yeah.
Smith did say something to you.
Well, yeah, doctors.
So that leaves us with the question of how serious do you think these problems are?
Well, I mean, I know that I have a lot of stress, and I've got to, these are things that will eventually, the custody stuff will get resolved, and so, I mean, they're not things that can go on forever, so.
Are you receiving any professional help?
I do have a therapist that I see for depression. I haven't made any appointments lately because I've had too many other appointments, and then I'm trying to get caught up at work, and so I haven't done that lately. But yes, I have a therapist that I see.
You mentioned that you've been having a lot of pain in connection with your surgery recently. How is that pain impacting your work?
Well, I still take some medications, and so sometimes, when I take the medication for the pain, I mean, it's just I'm slower. It slows me down a bit, and I have to, really concentrate hard to get my work done.
And what type of medication are you on?
Oxycodone.
Go ahead.
One of the other allegations was that you had a patient request records and that those weren't sent. Can you tell us what happened with that situation?
Yeah, I keep telling Dr. Smith that we need more office support, and I don't have time to get all those records together. I mean, this is a patient I saw for years, and they want all of their records, and I just I'm going to get to it. I just haven't gotten to it yet.
Do you know what the legal obligation is for
Oh.
records?
I was going to look that up before I came here today, and I was so stressed I forgot. But I know that I got to get it out to them.
How long has it been since they requested it?
I think it's been I think it's been a couple months. I'd have to go back and look.
Okay.
You know, you mentioned that you're working on these things that Dr. Smith had talked to you about and that these things will get done. What specific strategies have you set in place to make sure that you are getting your work done in a more timely basis?
Well, you know, like I said, I work over the lunch hour now, so I try and do that. I've been putting in time, you know, from home and on the weekends, and so I'm doing a lot to try and get caught up. What was the question again?
Just what kind of strategies or interventions you put into place to make sure that you do get
sure.
things done in a timely manner?
Yeah, and you know, it helps now because I have that performance improvement plan that tells me when I need to get things done too, so, yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. Dr. Bennett, what we are going to do now, we're going to ask you to take a seat back in the lobby at this point while the committee deliberates. And then when we're finished, we'll come out and ask you to come back in.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Take a seat, we'll be right back with you.
Sure.
If you need it.
So that was certainly helpful, and I feel for her. That's a lot of stress she's under, and wondering a little about what we need to do to address this. You know, sometimes we consider temporary suspensions. We also recognize not everyone in the room might be remembering what a temporary suspension's fully about. So, Josh, can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. It's sort of complicated, but I'll try to break it down. First, the law requires that the board shall temporarily suspend the credentials of a licensee if they have probable cause to believe continued practice by that person presents an imminent risk of harm.
Okay. So what if we were to temporarily suspend the licensee? When would that take effect?
It would take effect upon written notice to the licensee, and the notice has to state the specific reason for the suspension.
So at that point, once she's suspended, though, is the case over?
No, the suspension remains in effect until the board completes the investigation and issues a final order after a hearing.
So what kind of hearing are we talking about? Is that a hearing that's in front of the board or in front of an administrative law judge?
It would be a hearing under the Administrative Procedures Act, so it would be at OAH, the Office of Administrative Hearings, and it requires us to file a contested case.
So once suspended, are there timelines around when the hearing occurs?
Actually, yeah, we have to act pretty quickly and be ready to try the case. The hearing can occur no later than 30 days after issuance of the suspension order.
So does the administrative law judge decide the case then?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. It kind of.
Sounds like something, an answer our executive director would give.
An ALJ will issue a report within 30 days after closing the contested case record.
All right, so once the judge issues the report, does that decide the suspension issue?
Well, not completely. The judge only makes recommendations on whether or not discipline is warranted,
Okay.
and then the board takes that into consideration when they make their final determination.
So why does the board get to decide then if a judge has already heard the case?
Well, in this situation, the judge is only considered a fact finder. When the two sides, the board and the licensee, can't decide or come to an agreement on the facts or what actually happened, the judge will weigh the evidence and make a findings of fact. Based on those findings, the judge will make the recommendation to the board to consider.
So wait, the judge hears all these things, and why doesn't the judge just decide?
Well, it's the nature of administrative agencies. They're comprised of experts in the field. The board members serve as experts in the practice of psychology, and the judge relies upon their expertise to determine the proper outcome of the issue. To conclude the matter, the board then issues the final report within 30 days of receiving the ALJ report.
So with all that process information, does the committee believe this case rises to the level of a temporary suspension? Keeping in mind that if you're concerned about this licensee going back to work and practicing, that there's a HPSP, and that it's a high threshold that we have to prove, but putting her back to work, we could consider HPSP as a monitoring her.
Well, as far as suspension, I mean, she does seem to be impaired. There certainly does seem to be some stress in her life that's impacted her work. On the other hand, she has some insight into that. I didn't think she was reasonably coherent here. She's spaced out a little bit. I think it would be a tough sell to suspend her, but I'd be interested in what you guys think.
Yeah, I think so too. If the threshold is imminent,
Right.
I don't think she's there
think we're
at
there.
that point.
Well, Scott mentioned HPSP. It's true. HPSP provides monitoring services to licensees whose illnesses may impact their ability to practice safely.
So can you remind us, Josh, what does HPSP monitor?
HPSP covers physical, mental, and other health problems in addition to substance abuse.
And then one of the benefits for the licensee in HPSP is that they can usually continue to practice if they comply with their monitoring agreement.
So just a quick question, what are the ways that somebody could enter into HPSP?
Well, a licensee can self-refer. They can send themselves to HPSP. A third party, such as an employer, they can refer a licensee to HPSP. Or a health licensing board can refer to the program in one of two ways. They can do it without an order, basically ask the licensee to go, or they can do it on order, meaning under a disciplinary order directing the licensee specifically to enter into monitoring through the program, and you tell them to go rather than ask.
You know, I'm not sure we're ready right now to determine if HPSP is the right way to go. It seems like there is impairment. I know, Dr. Fisher, you were mentioning this earlier too, that it does seem like there's some impairment here, but it's really hard to really get a handle on exactly what that is. Dr. Bennett says repeatedly that it's stress, and certainly her life really, really is stressful. So it could be, but I'm just wondering if it might be worse than that. And I'm curious, Josh, can we order a fitness for duty examination in a case like this?
Yeah, it's one of those tools we can use as part of the investigative process. If the board has probable cause to believe that an individual who's regulated by the board is impaired, the board can direct that individual to submit to an independent mental, physical, or chemical dependency examination or evaluation.
And remind me here, Josh, what happens if she says no to the evaluation?
Well, an individual with a license that's regulated by the board is deemed to have consented under the Psychology Practice Act just by obtaining a license. So
Okay.
they've already agreed to
So they've basically consented to that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And keep in mind that the licensees are obligated to cooperate with investigations of the board as well. If they don't cooperate, that is also an independent grounds for discipline.
Great, good point.
So what if she were to say that she can't afford the evaluation?
Although in some circumstances, typically the board, if the board is going to require that the licensee have an evaluation and issue an order, they also pay for it and they get to choose the evaluator.
Okay.
So if we do this, then how is the public protected in the meantime? Because it's going to take a while to get that report.
One way we could refer the licensee to HPSP for monitoring. HPSP can do the assessments to determine whether the licensee has a condition that can be monitored, and if they find that they do, they'll work with the licensee in entering a participation agreement and monitoring plan.
So the HPSP evaluation is really just within the confines of, is there something going on for this person within those mental or physical or chemical dependency domains, and then do they meet their qualifications for being monitored? That's very different, though, than the fitness for duty evaluation that'll have much more to it, correct?
Correct.
HPSP will determine whether or not they need that evaluation, and they will be able to put somebody assigned as a monitor while they're at work.
The board could also ask the licensee to sign an agreement not to practice while the investigation is ongoing. We call it a stipulation to cease practice, and this stipulation is considered an interim or temporary order, so it's not a disciplinary action. It's not reported to the National Practitioner Data Bank, but it is a public action.
So, why is the stipulation to cease practice public?
It puts the public on notice, so you know that there are some concerns which support the psychologist not practicing at this time.
I see.
Well, I had one question about that, but I want to back up and think through whether HPSB should be included in the resolution of this. I mean, it does seem like it gives us another eye on her, you know, a little bit more insurance. What do you
I like the idea.
guys think about it? Okay.
Yeah.
I agree
So
too.
let's
Yeah.
let's plan on that, and then the stipulation regarding the stipulation to cease practice. What if she doesn't sign that?
There's no restriction on her practice. The licensee is a clear license until either a corrective or disciplinary action is issued.
Okay. All right. So we're looking at HPSP and then something.
Some
to
sort
get
of
better-
fitness for duty
to get a better
evaluation.
handle on
Yeah.
the situation.
Mhm.
And then once the evaluation for fitness for duty comes back, we can make further determinations.
Yeah, we can decide at that point.
So we're really continuing our investigation
Yep.
as well.
I think that makes sense. There's a lot of unanswered questions in this one.
Correct, and HPSP will report back to us if they do not follow through with the agreement, and then we can
Right.
continue on with our next step in the.
That'll be good.
Right.
Well, if we're ready to bring Doctor back in, I'll go get her.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Red. Here the committee decided to seek additional information. They're going to use their authority to request an evaluation. Dr. Bennett's going to be asked to comply with the order for evaluation. Once it's complete, the committee can then follow up on the information to craft a remedy to resolve the complaint that can protect the public. Green. Red. Green.
Funny. If you'd like to join us back.
Sure.
Did you find my lunch in the refrigerator when you got your water?
It didn't look very good.
It wasn't.
Dr. Bennett, the committee would like to thank you for coming in today. We know that it is stressful to go through a situation like this. We've had an opportunity to review all the materials that you sent in to us today, also the information that you've provided us through our questions. And we are proposing the following today, which will be basically a continuation of the investigation of the complaint. We're going to ask that you have a fitness for duty evaluation done, or some sort of evaluation that might be a little bit different than that. Part of the process is that we're going to refer you to the Health Professional Services Program. And oftentimes, as they get to know you, they will then maybe recommend a different type of evaluation. But we feel that there should be some sort of evaluation to make sure that you are fit to practice psychology right now. And then in the meantime, the Health Professional Services Program would be monitoring you. And then once we get a report back on the evaluation, then we will be able to follow up with you to continue this matter. You do not need to make a decision today. You will receive a letter from the board in the next couple of weeks, which will contain a paper copy of the proposed settlement. If you like, you can have an attorney review the document with you. And if you agree with the terms of the proposed settlement, sign the document and mail it back to the board. If you have any questions, feel free to contact our attorney and she will provide you with contact information.
Red. Looks like we're all done here with this conference. It looks like they're going to wrap up, and I guess there's not much else to see for this meeting. We will conclude our role play. Thank you. Oh, green. We have a few minutes for questions before we conclude our session here today, if anybody has any questions. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about that. Dr. Bennett is work for an ABC clinic. The ABC clinic has a supervisor, Dr. Smith. And then Dr. Smith continue to allow her to practicing psychology in ABC clinic. And why, if that is minimum, below minimum standard or impaired, why should not be consult, correct, discipline, or let go, or reduce hours? So if the board considers that they have the first-hand evidence of that, and then why would they done nothing? Would that mean that ABC clinic saying their work, her work, the better work is above the average?
Certainly.
So what?
Oh, go ahead.
What is the Dr. Smith for impaired continue practice in the ABC clinic?
Certainly, I'm going to take that one because it has several layers and including legal complexity. Oh, certainly, yes. So in sum, the question is, Dr. Smith is a member of ABC Clinic. There are 4 psychologists that comprise the clinic, and we're looking at what is the responsibility on Dr. Smith, in paraphrasing, regarding the Dr. Bennett, who is practicing within the clinic below the legal standard, his role in supervision, and perhaps she could be working limited hours or doing those things, and what does that mean for Dr. Smith? And the board is on notice of this information regarding Dr. Smith. In responding to that, in particular, ABC Clinic is structured as 4 independent psychologists who all work under their own independent license. It's not a supervisor-supervisee relationship. They all have the ability to practice independently. In terms of ABC Clinic's malpractice exposure, that's a different story. And I won't give legal advice, as I advised earlier. However, there are business implications for risk and liability and putting patients at risk. So while the board is concerned about public safety, the licenses follow the individual. And Dr. Smith did meet his obligations to the board to report that impairment in a complaint. And so he's brought that forward. He's tried to work with her. The clinic members may wish to get together and make some sort of determination about Dr. Bennett's participation in ABC Clinic. So, thank you. Yes?
Could you remind me again of who is HPSP? Who is the health? Who's on that? Who pays them, et cetera, et cetera?
Do you want me to take it?
Go ahead.
I can do that. The Health Professional Services Program is a diversion program of the health-related licensing boards. There are 17 health-related licensing boards who are fully funded by licensing fees. The participation in HPSP is paid by the respective boards based on a formula per participant. It's approximately $1,300 for each participant in HPSP, and the board covers those costs. It's important to note that the board covers those costs regardless of whether they know of the applicant's identity and participation. So for example, psychologist A self-reports to HPSP. We get an aggregate number of our participants in it. We do not get told who is in HPSP if they self-report, so that confidentiality is maintained. We still pay for their participation. The governance and oversight and management of HPSP is through a program board, a program committee board, who has a representative from each health-related licensing board on it to make governance and structuring decisions. There's also an advisory committee with participation from the Department of Health that advises the program committee. It is independent and outside of the building for the health boards. They don't reside in our facility to provide additional confidentiality. They have their own executive director as well and are directly managed by a sponsoring board. And in this case, it's currently the Board of Dentistry who administers their budget and assists. Anybody else? Excellent. We will move on to our conclusion here. So many of us who are here today know that the board has been working tirelessly on its strategic plan. It's been building its educational programming and stakeholder outreach. We're in year 3 of our plan, but we still have a lot of work to do. And we appreciate the development of those goals and that work and that vision through our licensees and our stakeholders. As we end our time together here today, we wish to share with you some of the important remarks for, this year that we've captured through one of our initiatives, which is a video blog that we have going, whereby we interview board members and others, and it's just in its early stages. We are going to release for the first time the video blog of Dr. Scott Fisher. Our hope in sharing that with you to close the conference is to update you on the progress we've made, and as the video alludes, to reflect and celebrate.
I've been licensed as a psychologist in Minnesota since 1999, and my practice is primarily forensic assessments. Most of those are for either family court or criminal court cases. And I also have a small therapy practice, maybe about 5 clients a week. Before I was licensed and I was working in another state, I worked for a psychologist who was unethical, got in a lot of trouble with the board, and I really was victimized by that, came out on the losing end of that. And at that time, I really didn't feel like there were a lot of resources to help me to figure it out. And I was sensitized really early in my career to the importance of regulation. And that, I think, planted the seed. And then as I worked more, as I learned more, as I worked in the forensic arena, I got involved in a lot of thorny ethical problems and interesting legal situations, and that really added more fuel to my interest. And then when the opportunity came to serve on the board, I was very happy to do that. The thing that surprised me most was the tone of the board staff and board members. I think when you don't know the people, you think of them as regulators, you think of them almost as the bad guys. And I have not found any bad guys on the board yet. The board is following a relatively new strategic plan and trying to take a more active role in education and a more active role in areas other than strict regulation. That's been a major accomplishment. The other big accomplishment since I joined was changing the Practice Act, changing the rules, which was something that was a long time in the making and finally got accomplished. It's important because it helps support the regulation function. If we're out there educating people, teaching people about the rules, teaching people about legal and ethical practice, then we have fewer complaints to worry about. We have better educated licensees, and our job as regulators is easier. Public protection is our responsibility to the public to make sure that to the best of our ability they're getting services from psychologists that are helpful and they're not being harmed by unethical or problematic practice. There are some difficult things to think about on kind of an intellectual left brain level. There's a lot of stuff to learn. That's the second hardest part. I think the hardest part is being on the CRC, the Complaint Resolution Committee, and being face to face with a psychologist who's had some real problems in their practice. And we're required to take some action for community protection, but also have some sympathy for the licensee. And trying to balance out treating the licensee with respect and protecting the public in the way that we need to is hard at a very gut emotional level, and that has been the hardest thing. That we're doing a job and that we are promoting public protection, and we're going to do that very vigorously, but we're also going to do that with great respect for them, no matter what they may have done. And so we will not let them off easily in terms of holding them accountable, but we'll do that with in a way that allows them to keep some dignity and demonstrates respect for them and for the process. As a practicing psychologist, I am used to making decisions that impact individual people or perhaps families. And on the board, you have an opportunity to make a broader impact on the whole practice of psychology and as far as public protection, an even broader impact on the public. I only get one. The first thing that comes to mind is to keep up the good work. And I would expand on that by saying that what you are doing is service. You're being paid very little for it. You are not taken for granted. And you're very much appreciated. It's easier, it's more convenient, and every year it gets more natural for more people. I think younger people in particular use online access very automatically. That's the first thing that they think of. And every year that goes by, more and more people are in that category, that's the first thing that they think of. Innovative means to be able to think creatively about the use of technology, and not to use technology just to use it, but to really keep our eye on the ball. What are the things that are most important to us? And then think about how technology can serve those functions. Again, it's hard to pick one. I can remember one complaint resolution committee meeting that we had that took all day and then some. And those meetings can be over in 3 or 4 hours, or they can take 7 or 8. My memory is that this one took 11, but I think it was probably more like 9 or 10. But what I remember is that we had a number of really difficult cases, that the committee was working very well together, and that the staff was contributing. And I remember one staff member who was relatively new at the time, and we were in overtime. He was supposed to go home, and the executive director said, you can go if you want. And he said, no, I'm staying. And it was in a tone of voice like I wouldn't even think of going home. We had important work to do. Everybody chipped in, and I was very drained at the end, but it felt like we had really done a great job that day. I can talk about that on a couple levels. The first is really to keep doing a lot of the things that we have been doing, but get more efficient at them. By that I mean to continue the public outreach that we're doing, to continue the use of technology to make the board more user-friendly, to continue to build bridges with licensees. Those are all things that we've been doing since I came on. We've done well, but there's still work to do. When I was elected, I was elected in part on an initiative to promote ethical practice of psychology in the legal arena. And so I want to put some work and some time and some thought into that, and to ask the same of other board members. I don't know that I can be very specific, but I think that it will have to do with advances in technology and the associated problems with maintaining privacy. So that takes a lot of forms. It could be telepsychology and how people can practice across jurisdictional lines. It could be our storage of our records electronic health records and how to do that in a way that preserves privacy. I think that there are a lot of branches of that, but what I'm fairly sure is that it will involve technology and some of the complications of practice. Well, there are a couple. One is that Minnesota has a number of professional licensing boards whose licensees are doing overlapping work. So you could be a therapist and be licensed by the Board of Social Work, the Board of Marriage and Family Therapy, the Board of Psychology, possibly the Board of Medicine. And so there are issues that cut across all of those disciplines, and trying to work with the other boards and with the other professions will be important. The other thing about Minnesota that is somewhat unique is we have one big population center and a lot of outlying areas that are geographically pretty far away. And so trying to promote practice in the areas that aren't the Twin Cities and to have psychologists who are licensed in those areas feel like they're part of the bigger picture in the state will be important.
Thank you. I want to sincerely thank everyone who took the time to attend today. It means a lot to us to see you out here, to meet you, to talk with you, and to answer your questions and to be of service. We look forward to hosting this conference again in the future. As you pack up, two very important things. For our aspiring thespians, we have the video feedback out there. Don't be afraid of it. We would love to have any remarks that you would be willing to share with Leo about the conference, about the substance, about the PSYPACT, anything you feel like sharing with us today. He'll be out there taking some video feedback after the conference. So please do that. Make sure you hand in your evaluation. If you give it to a board staff member, we're going to do that out in the lobby, not at the door here. So if you go out to the lobby, you'll be able to get your certificate, trade in your evaluation, and get your credit. And so just thank you, and remember, if we can ever be of service, don't hesitate to call. Thank you.